A very good afternoon, everyone. Please confirm, is my screen visible and I'm audible or not? Then we can start. Thank you, Nikita, Rohit, Nilayan, Pragya, Shivya. So let's start. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I'll be giving you a broad overview of the common childhood poisonings. Okay. So we'll not be going into a lot of details about the individual specific poisons because you might have studied about them in the forensic classes also, and a little bit of it would be covered in pharmacology as well. So we'll be trying to integrate things together and discuss some clinical scenarios and discuss some important situations which are relevant for us, and as per your MCI competencies also, the things that we need to cover. Okay, so in this presentation, we'll be discussing a little bit about the epidemiology, some common poisonings in childhoods and toxidromes. How do you approach to a patient with suspected poisoning? That is, what are the things that you need to look at from the history, the physical examination, the investigations that you need to do, the broad principles of management, and a little bit about some important individual poisons. Now, what do you mean by a poison? So basically, a poison can be any substance, solid, liquid, or gas, which, if introduced in a living body or brought in contact, so it can be externally applied or ingested or inhaled, and it will produce ill health, or it can even produce death by its constitutional or local effects or both. Okay. And WHO defines poisoning as a situation when the cells are injured or destroyed by the inhalation, injection, or absorption of a toxic substance. But basically, what is very important to ponder upon is, any substance, if taken in a very large dose, can, can be harmful. So it is basically a dose that distinguishes poison from a non-poisonous substance. But basically, generally by poison, we refer to those substances which even in very small amounts can be poisonous, right? So, in the children, so in the pediatric age group, accidental poisoning is quite common that, they do not know. Children have an exploratory nature. They do not know what is the thing that is kept. They can see a colorful liquid kept, blue colored liquid kept in the room, or some liquid kept in in some, cold drink bottle in the washroom, and they can, just drink a little bit of it. Or some pills they can find lying around here and there. So accidental poisoning is very common in children, while in adolescents, suicidal poisoning is commoner. Now, it has been seen that in males, the incidence of poisoning is more than females, and among the children, the most common age group involved is 1 to 5 year age group. Now, in various studies, it has been found that the commonest route of poisoning is ingestion, followed by percutaneous, followed by inhalational. Looking at the common poisons in children, you can see majority of the poisons in children are household products. So household products, including corrosives, pyrethroids, kerosene, they comprise the majority, followed by industrial products like thinner, turpentine oil, diesel. Okay, then some drugs can also cause poisoning like thyroxine, risperidone. So if an adult in the family is on certain medications, like for hypothyroidism, if they are on daily thyroxine, or they are on some antidepressants or something, so the children have an easy access to those medicines at home. So there is a propensity of poisoning by these drugs also. Okay, and organophosphate poisoning is more important, especially in the rural scenario. Now, how do you approach to a patient with poisoning? Now, poisoning can present as a medical emergency. So the initial approach is not going to be different from any other sick child. But what you have to remember is we have to treat the patient and not the poison. So first look at the vitals of the patient. Okay. Ensure the airway, breathing, circulation, and mental status is all right or not. Okay. Stabilize the patient, secure IV access, and put monitors to monitor for the vital signs. Now, coming to the history, initially it is better to take a targeted history and physical examination. Okay, And obviously children are not going to, most of the times they're not going to be able to tell themselves that what is happening. So family members or friends can be taken as a source for history. And history should of course include age, developmental history, social history, any allergies, medications, past medical history. Now when has a child ingested or inhaled or come in contact with a particular poisonous substance been implicated, the approximate amount of substance ingested if someone can comment upon, last oral intake, and what were the events prior to presentation, and place or circumstances surrounding the exposure. Now, even if a family member of a child brings to you saying that the child has ingested this, but we should always take it with a pinch of salt. Okay, so basically, we do not know the situation or circumstances whether the child has taken it himself or has been administered by someone else. So basically, any case of poisoning is to be made a medical legal case. Okay. So there is, I'm sure, all if any of you would have known in all the emergencies or casualties, there's a provision of making either a non-MLC case or a MLC, that is medical legal case. So any child of if comes with suspected poisoning, you have to make a medical legal case and you have to inform the police for further investigations. We will do the medical part of it. Okay, we are going to examine the child and treat based on the symptoms. But what was the intention of poisoning, whether safe household is available or not, or whether something else is implicated, that is for the police to decide. But our job is to inform the authorities about it. Okay. Now, on physical examination, obviously, we look at the vitals first. So, you can get tachycardia in certain poisonings like atropine or anticholinergics, okay? Antihistaminics. Bradycardia can be there in organophosphate poisoning, carbamates, morphine. You can get respiratory depression in cases of poisoning due to morphine and opioid analogs. Hypertension again can be due to antihistaminic toxicity or, atropine. On the other hand, you can get hypotension again due to morphine or opioid analogs. Hyperthermia can be there in antihistamines or atropine, and hypothermia again in morphine and opioid analogs. Okay, so you can see the vitals give you important clues about what could be the possible group of drugs implicated. Now you can get altered mental status like agitation, delirium, and psychosis in poisoning due to cocaine or amphetamine. Coma or seizures can be seen in poisoning due to atropine or antihistamines. Now, pupils we know can be dilated, so there can be mydriasis in poisoning due to cocaine, amphetamine, atropine, antihistamine, and it can be constricted in morphine and organophosphates. And you can also get nystagmus in certain situations, right? So these are what you get on physical examination in certain poisonings. Now the skin can be, sweaty skin can be there, okay? So diaphoretic, cold, clammy skin you can get in organophosphate poisoning or poisoning due to cocaine and amphetamine. While a dry, hot skin you can get in atropine or antihistaminic poisoning, okay? Bowel sounds again can be increased in cocaine or amphetamine and decreased in morphine or opioids. You can again get hyperactivity of the bowel in organophosphate poisoning. Now, lab investigations, you can get certain electrolyte imbalances, you can get blood sugar abnormalities, okay, like hyperglycemia in epinephrine, theophylline, or salicylate toxicity, hypoglycemia in ethanol, insulin, and beta blockers, okay. Similarly, you can get acidosis and alkalosis in different situations. So basically, these electrolyte abnormalities or glucose abnormalities or acid-base abnormalities are mainly seen in poisoning due to certain medications or drugs. So whenever a child is coming with suspected poisoning, you have to inquire if any adult in the family is on certain daily medications, and you should keep a high index of suspicion that poisoning due to those drugs or medicines is possible in these scenarios, right? On investigations, again, you can see this chest X-ray. This shows, the shadows due to the heavy metals. So inhalation of heavy metals or even ingestion can give rise to these similar opacities in the bowel as well. Okay. ECG can again show PR interval prolonged in drugs due to digoxin or lithium toxicity, QRS prolongation in cocaine, chloroquine, or cardiac glycoside toxicity, QTC prolongation again in other group of drugs like arsenic, amiodarone, methadone, and erythromycin. Now, upper GI endoscopy may be needed in corrosive poisoning, that is poisoning by acids and alkalis, which we'll be discussing in a little bit more detail because that is fairly common. And lots of children come to our casualty after having ingested these substances, right? Now, as you've seen, it is very, very difficult to remember individually which drug or which poison is causing what features. So that is why what we have done is we have, made groups of drugs which cause similar features, and we've clubbed them together into toxidromes. Now, what do you mean by toxidromes? So toxidrome comes from the word toxic syndrome, okay, or toxicity syndromes. So basically, toxidromes are nothing but recognized poisoning syndromes suggestive of toxicity from specific substances or specific classes of substances, okay. So, groups of drugs which cause similar manifestations are grouped into a particular toxidrome. Like you have the sympathomimetic toxidrome, the anticholinergic toxidrome. Now, both the sympathomimetic and anticholinergic toxidromes have certain features in common. In both of them, you can get hypertension, tachycardia, and elevated temperature. Agitation, psychosis, so mental status changes can be seen in both. And again, dilatation of pupils or mydriasis can be seen in sympathomimetics as well as anticholinergics. Now, what is different is in toxicity due to sympathomimetics, you can get a diaphoretic pale skin. So a lot of sweating can be there as in amphetamine or cocaine toxicity. While in anticholinergic toxicity, as in atropine poisoning, you get classically the dry, hot, flushed, red skin. So that is how you can clinically distinguish between them. And of course, the specific history about this substance ingested would give you another clue, right? So you can see the sympathomimetic and anticholinergic toxidrome have lots of things in common with each other, right? Now, who can identify what flower is this and what fruit is this? Which flower is this? Anyone? Which flower is this and which fruit is this? Yes. So very good. Swati, Riya, Pariniti, Shiveya, Purva. Yes. So this is Datura. So this is the Datura flower and that is the Datura fruit. Okay. So this is Datura, and because of this, you have atropine poisoning. Okay. So this leads to atropine overdose, right? And in atropine overdose, remember your pharmacology days where you came, where you had, heard about this mnemonic: hot as a hare, mad as a hatter, red as a beet, and dry as a bone. So in atropine toxicity, you get increased temperature and there is decreased sweating. So there is dry, flushed skin, and there is confusion and delirium. So altered sensorium is there. And because of the flushed face and tachycardia, we say red as a beet and dry as a bone because the secretions are all decreased and there's a lot of thirst. So this is atropine poisoning, classically what we see, right? So moving ahead to another toxidrome. So there is another toxidrome that is cholinergic toxidrome. Now this cholinergic toxidrome you characteristically get in poisoning due to organophosphates or carbamates and even in early mushroom poisoning. Now what would happen in cholinergic toxidrome? So the cholinergic features or the parasympathetic features are going to take an upper hand. So what will happen? The parasympathetic system causes a cardiac depression, but rest, all the things, basically the secretions are going to increase. The bowels are going to contract. The bowel smooth muscles are going to contract. So bowel sounds are going to be hyperactive. So in the cholinergic toxidrome, you get bradycardia. Okay. Then there can be altered sensorium, confusion, coma, and muscles can get stimulated, causing fasciculations. Pupils can be small or meiosis can be there. The skin, lot of sweating can be there, so diaphoresis. Bowel sounds, they can be hyperactivity, and you can have lots of secretions pouring out from all the orifices. So you can have diarrhea, bronchospasm with a lot of bronchial secretions, emesis or vomiting, excessive lacrimation, excessive salivation. So all these are features of organophosphate poisoning or cholinergic toxidrome. Okay, also seen in poisoning due to carbamates and early mushroom poisoning. Very, very important, right? Now, what happens in organophosphate poisoning? So, in order to understand that, first let us see what happens normally. So, at this neuromuscular junction. So, what happens is this black thing is the acetylcholine that gets released and binds to the acetylcholine receptors and muscle contraction occurs. And this yellow star is acetylcholinesterase, which is going to degrade the acetylcholine and the stimulation of the muscle stops. But this happens normally. But when organophosphate is there, which is depicted by the red triangle here. So organophosphates are going to bind this acetylcholinesterase enzyme. So what will happen? This acetylcholine is going to continuously stimulate the acetylcholine receptors in the postsynaptic neuron. And lot of muscle contraction and stimulation, continuous stimulation of the postsynaptic neuron is going to take place. So that is what happens in the organophosphate poisoning, right? And you can remember the features of organophosphate poisoning by the mnemonic dumbbells. So where there is D for diarrhea, U for excessive urination, M for meiosis or constricted pupils, right? B for bradycardia, B for bronchospasm, E for emesis, L for lacrimation, L for lethargy, S for salivation, and S for seizures. Okay, so that is the dumbbells mnemonic which you can use to remember the features of organophosphate poisoning. Apart from this, there are some additional features also in acetylcholine toxicity. So which are basically due to the nicotinic effects. We know the acetylcholine acts both on muscarinic receptors and the nicotinic receptors. So because of the nicotinic effects, okay, because of the nicotinic receptor which is there on the neuromuscular junction, you can get muscle weakness, fasciculations, paralysis, and muscle twitching. So many features you can get in organophosphate toxicity, right? Now moving ahead to some less important toxidromes, which are not very important. The first ones which I told you, the cholinergic toxidrome, the anticholinergic or sympathomimetic toxidromes, those are very, very important for you. Some other toxidromes are those caused by opioids or sedative hypnotics. Again, in both of them, you will get respiratory, you can get respiratory, basically depression, not distress, respiratory depression, bradycardia, low BP and temperature, altered sensorium can be there, okay? Pupils can be small, the skin usually nothing much. Bowel sounds can be normal to decreased, and morphine or opioid analogs can cause this type of feature. So it is always easier to remember the syndrome caused by or the features caused by a group of drugs rather than the individual drugs. Okay. Now, if a child comes to you in the emergency, in the casualty, and there is no history of exposure to a poison coming up front, how do you diagnose or how do you suspect it to be a case of poisoning? So these are some of the scenarios in which we can suspect the same. So if there is a sudden onset of symptoms and that too in a cluster, so lots of symptoms occurring together suddenly. Prior to that, the child was absolutely fine with no other features. If you're having some multi-system organ dysfunction, if there's a rapid progression of symptoms, and the scenario, if there are easily available medications or drugs in home, if a child is at risk, that means there's a previous history of ingestion, age is 1 to 5 years, and you also have to look at the social issues like whether who is taking care of the child at home, whether there is an appropriate caregiver to take care of the child, or sometimes the parents are working and there is say a help at home who is also quite young and not able to take care of the child properly, and the child is able to ingest or take whatever the child wishes to. So you have to look at all the circumstances and see if it is a potential case of poisoning. Okay. Now moving on to the principles of management. So remember, there are 4 things that we need to do apart from, of course, the initial stabilization that we talked about. So there is supportive care, okay? There is the decontamination. There is directed therapy or antidotes, which is available for very few poisons. And there's also something known as enhanced elimination, okay? Now we'll be dealing with them briefly, one by one, right? Before that, I want each of you to note down that there is, a National Poison Information Center at AIIMS, New Delhi, which was established by the Pharmacology Department of AIIMS in 1995, and it provides round-the-clock service. So, sometimes a child comes to you or a person comes to you who has ingested something, and you do not know how to manage that. Like if a child, say drinks the liquid in the all-out mosquito repellent that you use, the child drinks that and comes. Okay. Now, immediately, if you want to, get some information, you can contact them. So they usually respond. These are their numbers. Okay. And they provide round the clock service. They'll tell you what are the things that you need to monitor for this child, and if there is any particular specific thing in management that we can do apart from the supportive care. Okay. Now, this we already mentioned that all cases of poisoning are medico legal cases, and it is the responsibility of the medical person who is seeing the patient to judge all the cases properly and inform the police. We need not do the investigation ourselves, but it is our at least duty to make it a MLC registered file and to inform the police, get the police informed through proper channels so that they can carry on the further investigation, and we can take help from the Poison Information Center. And if required, we can preserve samples according to the particular poison. So if he has ingested something, maybe we can, if we are doing a gastric lavage, we can preserve that sample. All right. Now moving on to supportive care. So the things in management, we said the first thing is supportive care. Then we said is decontamination. Then we said the directed therapy or antidotes. And the fourth thing we said was enhanced elimination to be used in some cases, right? Now, first discussing about the supportive care. Now, what is the goal of the supportive care? So basically, supportive care is to support a patient's vital functions until the patient can eliminate the toxin himself or herself. So the first thing we already discussed, we take care of the ABC, that is the airway, breathing and circulation. If the airway is severely compromised, even intubation, endotracheal intubation may be needed. Okay. You have to treat hypotension or shock if there is present by using fluid boluses and if required even inotropes. You have to do an ECG of the child and check for arrhythmias, and if they are present you have to manage accordingly. If the child is having seizures, you have to give anti-epileptics, and you have to monitor the perfusion, the vitals of the child, okay, and the urine output as well, right? Now moving on to the second step, that is decontamination. Now, what do you mean by decontamination? So basically, decontamination, the goal of this is to minimize the absorption of the toxic substance. Remember, this decontamination cannot do anything about the poison that has already been absorbed by the body. Okay, it can just minimize or stop the further absorption of the toxic substance. But this absorption that has already occurred, it cannot do anything about it. All right. So, of course, you will do this decontamination only after initial resuscitation and stabilization of the patient. Okay. The specific method that is to be used for decontamination depends on the properties of the toxin and the route of exposure. Right. The first step is removal of contaminated clothing and particulate material. Okay, you have to remove that. Especially this is relevant in cases of organophosphate poisoning, right? And flushing for a minimum of 10 to 20 minutes should be done. In cases where there has been an inhalation exposure, you can move the patient to fresh air and supplement oxygen. All right. Now, there are some methods of GI decontamination as well for those who have ingested the toxin, right? Now, what are the methods of GI decontamination? They are the syrup of ipecac, gastric lavage, cathartics, activated charcoal, and whole bowel irrigation. So let's discuss about all of them one by one. All right. Now, this syrup of ipecac, I am sure you would have heard about it from your pharmacology days. So this syrup of ipecac is a tussive agent. We know the we know the anti-emetic agents that prevent vomiting. So this is an emetic agent basically. So this syrup of ipecac works in both CNS as well as locally in the GI tract to produce vomiting. Okay. But the disadvantages that that are associated are dyselectrolytemia and aspiration pneumonia. So that is why the syrup Ipecac is no longer recommended, right? Now, gastric lavage, what do you do in that? So we put a large tube into the stomach to aspirate the contents of the stomach and flush it with water or normal saline. But this gastric lavage again is time consuming and it may induce bradycardia. Okay, so that is why this gastric lavage has now been replaced by activated charcoal. We'll be discussing a bit more detail about activated charcoal because this is the most important method of GI decontamination that is used nowadays. Okay. Now, what about cathartics? The cathartics decrease absorption of poison by expulsion from the GI tract. Okay. The disadvantages of using cathartics are it can cause vomiting, abdominal cramps, dehydration, or dyselectrolytemia. The cathartics reduce transit time, but not the absorption time. Okay. Whole bowel irrigation, what we do in that? So, prior to doing this colonoscopy, especially endoscopy and colonoscopy, you would have heard that they give large volumes of polyethylene glycol, PEG solution to clear off the bowel. So, large volumes of this PEG electrolyte solution can be used to wash out the entire GI tract. Again, it can cause vomiting, abdominal pain, and abdominal distension. And it is useful specifically in cases of ingestion of iron, lithium, and sustained release preparations. Okay. Now, a little bit more about activated charcoal. So you can see these activated charcoal tablets are also available, and it is also available in a powdered form like this. And it is freely available on Amazon also, so it can be ordered easily, right? Now, what do you mean by activated charcoal? So this is not the charcoal that you're using to make the roads and all, right? This is activated charcoal. So charcoal is basically activated by heating to extreme temperature. So what will happen if you heat the charcoal? There will be an extensive network of pores that will get created in this. And because of that, it provides a very large adsorptive surface area, okay? Remember, it's not absorption, it is AD, adsorption. So in your chemistry, you would have, read about adsorption. Basically, that means on the surface. So more the surface area, more adsorption is going to take place of the toxins. So the toxins will bind to it and it will also prevent absorption from the GI tract. Again, remember, it cannot do anything about the toxin which is already absorbed and has entered the bloodstream. It can only prevent the further absorption from the GI tract. Okay. The dose in children is 1 gram per kg and a maximum of 30 to 50 grams may be given. In adolescents and adults, 50 to 100 grams may be used. Okay. Now, activated charcoal, the drugs and toxins for which it is quite useful include phenytoin, the opioids, calcium channel blockers, amphetamines, cocaine, antihistamines, okay? Even paracetamol toxicity, aspirin, barbiturates, benzodiazepines. So for most of the drugs, it is helpful, but the agents poorly absorbed by activated charcoal, remember, in corrosive poisoning, it has no role. In poisoning due to hydrocarbons like kerosene, again, it has no role. In poisoning due to alcohol, cyanides, heavy metals, iron, lithium, again, it has a very limited role. Okay. Now, this is again another, formulation of activated charcoal that is available. So ideally, activated charcoal is to be given within 1 hour of ingestion. And it is a very impalatable drug. I mean, it tastes horrible. So you can improve the palatability by adding flavors, like you can add some chocolate syrup or you can give the mixture with ice cream. If of course the child is awake and conscious and stable then. And before administering, one must ensure that the patient's airway is intact or protected. And what are the conditions in which we are not going to use it? Remember, if there is GI bleeding or corrosions, if it is an unconscious child not able to swallow, we are not going to use it. Okay. Now, next we said is directed therapy or antidotes. Now, unfortunately, for very few poisons, you have antidotes available. Like for paracetamol toxicity, you have an antidote that is N-acetylcysteine. You need not remember the dose of the antidotes, at least the names you should remember. For anticholinergic toxicity, the antidote is physostigmine. For toxicity due to benzodiazepines, the antidote is flumazenil. For opioid toxicity, it is naloxone. For toxicity due to iron, it is desferrioxamine. For heparin toxicity, it is protamine. Okay. So these are some of the specific antidotes which are available, and you can see for most of the poisonings, specific antidotes are not available. So it is a supportive therapy that is going to make a huge difference. Okay. Now, what do you mean by enhanced elimination? So enhanced elimination basically takes care of the poison that is already absorbed by the body. So this is basically to increase the clearance of already absorbed poison. All right. The methods available for enhanced elimination include hemodialysis. You can see what happens in hemodialysis. So in hemodialysis, the patient's blood comes out and goes to the dialysis machine. Okay. And there is a blood pump that is there. So the blood goes through the dialyzer where the impurities are filtered out, and the filtered blood is again pumped back to the patient's body. So that is the principle of hemodialysis. It can be used in cases of severe cases of methanol poisoning, ethylene glycol, or lithium. You can do exchange transfusion in severe cases of methemoglobinemia or arsenic-induced hemolysis. And plasmapheresis or plasma exchange can also be used in severe cases. Okay. Now let us move to some case scenarios. Okay, the real life practical situations. So Kajal, a 4-year female studying in nursery, presented to emergency department with these perioral burns. You can see around the oral cavity, and was not able to swallow her own saliva. There was drooling of saliva. On examination, the heart rate is 112 per minute, respiratory rate 34 per minute. The saturation is 92% on room air. What do you think could be possible? What toxicity is possible in this scenario? Yes, waiting for your answers. Very good. Nilayan says acid ingestion. Swati, corrosive, very good. Pariniti, Raghav, yes, acid or alkali is very much possible in this situation. So it looks like a case of corrosive poisoning, corrosive ingestion. Very good, Shubham, also. Okay. So let us see what happened in this case. So on taking detailed history, we came to know that she had consumed some liquid which was kept in a plastic bottle in toilet, right? So it appears to be a case of corrosive or caustic poisoning. Now, corrosive poisoning may be by acids, it may be by alkalis, and remember, alkalis are more dangerous than acids. We'll be coming to as to why. It can be due to oxidants and heavy metals as well. Children less than 5 years, as we've already mentioned, are commonly involved. And storage of these substances in mineral water bottles and other household containers increases the risk of toxicity, right? Now you can see the common acids that are available in household scenarios. I'm sure all of you must have seen them. So Lysol, this Harpic, vinegar, battery water. These are all acids used commonly in households. And some of the alkalis that are used are bleach, the hair dyes, okay, the Vim dishwashers, the phenol solution. So you can see that these acids and alkalis are readily accessible in every household. Now, what happens in corrosive poisoning? So there is a lot of difference between what happens in acid poisoning, what happens in alkali poisoning. Okay, though both will manifest with perioral burns and all, but the severity is going to be different. The areas affected most are going to be different. Okay, and the pathophysiology is also slightly different. Now, what happens in acid toxicity is acids precipitate protein, and there is coagulation necrosis, while alkalis cause liquefaction necrosis. So I'm sure in your pathology you would have discussed about different types of necrosis, right? So acids will cause coagulation necrosis and precipitate the proteins. So what will happen as a result? The proteins are precipitated, so a layer forms on the mucosa. So it does not penetrate very deep in the mucosa. So very deep injuries do not occur due to acid toxicity. It is more of superficial injury. while alkalis are going to cause liquefaction necrosis, which can penetrate deep through the mucosa and can even cause perforation, right? Now, what are the factors that determine the corrosive potential? So, whether the acid or alkali is concentrated or very dilute, the physical form, the amount ingested, the duration of contact, pH of the agent, and presence or absence of food. So, these are some of the factors that determine the corrosive potential, right? Now, acids we know have a bad smell and taste. Remember, if you smell vinegar, how bad it smells. So, bad smell and taste is there. So, that is why, even if a child is ingesting that, he is going to ingest only a very small quantity and rapidly he swallows it. So, this acid causes more gastric injury than esophagus. So, stomach is usually more involved in acid poisoning than esophagus. Why? Because it has a bad smell and taste, it is ingested in small quantity and rapidly swallowed because of the bad smell and taste, right? But remember, it is more of the superficial damage that will occur in acid toxicity. Very deep injury is not going to happen mostly. But on the other hand, what happens in toxicity due to alkalis? Alkalis we know are colorless, tasteless, odorless, and more viscous or thick. So because they are tasteless and odorless, they can be ingested in larger amount. Because they are more viscous and thick, and there is a process of liquefaction necrosis that happens in alkali toxicity, it keeps them in mucosal contact for a longer time. So now do you get it? That in alkali toxicity, why deeper injury, which can involve all the layers of the esophagus, is possible. Okay, perforation, esophageal perforation is also possible in alkali toxicity. So that is the reason why in acid toxicity, more stomach injury than esophagus and more superficial injury. While in alkali, more esophageal injury and deeper injury is possible. Okay, so that is how you can distinguish between both, right? And what happens is necrosis can happen within seconds of exposure here. Ulceration and perforation, if it is to occur, will occur within 1 to 3 days. Fibrosis can happen in 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, and stricture can develop in weeks to years, and even carcinoma can happen at these sites. The clinical features, as we saw in this case also, there can be burns in the oral cavity, drooling of saliva because the patient is not able to swallow his or her own saliva. There can be difficulty in swallowing, dysphagia, pain abdomen, nausea, vomiting, and there can be GI bleeds leading to hematemesis and melena. If the larynx is also involved, there can be hoarseness and some voice difficulties. There can be stridor as well. And chemical pneumonitis, pulmonary edema, and aspiration is always possible. And there can be perforation of the stomach or esophagus, which can give rise to peritonitis or mediastinitis, right? The complications, again, we already mentioned there can be perforation, so esophageal perforation and mediastinitis. Now, esophagus is more involved in alkali or acid? So, esophagus is more involved in alkali toxicity, right? And gastric or stomach is more involved in acid toxicity, right? So, gastric perforation and peritonitis following acid ingestion is possible. Severe glottic edema with respiratory obstruction is possible, and aspiration pneumonia and even circulatory collapse or shock is possible, right? Late complications are stricture, stenosis, and carcinoma. Now, how would you investigate such a child? So, we will do the hemogram, the LFT, KFT, because KFT can get altered in carbolic acid toxicity, and amylase lipase can be elevated in poisoning due to hydrochloric acid. Now, one thing very, very important is that if you have a facility, you have to do upper GI endoscopy in all cases of corrosive poisoning within 48 hours of presentation. Okay. An endoscope should not be passed beyond the first area of ulceration, because if you try to pass beyond that, you can, iatrogenically cause a perforation. Now, why do you think the upper GI endoscopy is to be done within 48 hours, not later than that? So there is a dictum that either you do upper GI endoscopy within 48 hours or you do it, few weeks later. But you don't do it, say, on day 3 or day 4 or day 5 of poisoning. Why? So what do you think? Who can answer? So chocolate for one who answers. So why upper GI endoscopy should be done within 48 hours and not beyond that? Very good. So Nilayan says that to assess the damage, else necrosis sets in and makes the wall friable. Yes, very good. Swati, high risk of perforation. Nikita also answers perforation risk increases. Yes, Purva, Pariniti, Pradyuman, very right. So you have to do it ideally within 48 hours, okay? And if you're not able to do within 48 hours, you do it few weeks later. You do not do it at day 3, 4, 5, 6 of presentation, right? So very, very good. So basically, initial endoscopy after 48 hours of ingestion is not advised because injured esophagus is going to enter a phase of ulceration and granulation and will get easily perforated if you do beyond 48 hours. So initial endoscopy, either do it within 48 hours of presentation or do it few weeks later. Okay. Do not do it in the intervening period. And on doing endoscopy, you can see the features, and there is one staging known as Zargar's staging, which is used to look at the esophageal and gastric injury. Okay, you need not go into the details, but you need to remember that upper GI endoscopy is done to assess the damage. Now, how do you manage such a child? So immediately you ask the child to rinse the mouth so that any local damage that is happening that stops. You have to do the hemodynamic correction if required. You have to start IV fluids because the child will not be able to take anything orally. Gastric lavage and induced vomiting are contraindicated because of the risk of aspiration. If there is respiratory distress, stridor or hoarseness, urgent intubation or tracheostomy needs to be done. Upper GI endoscopy, we already discussed, should be performed within 48 hours. And PPI, proton pump inhibitors or H2 blockers, to be used in all cases of esophageal or gastric injury. Till when we need to give IV fluids? So we need to give it till the time the child is able to swallow his oral secretions, okay? Feeding gastrostomy is to be done in severely burned esophagus. When you think that for a long time the child will not be able to take orally, so we need to institute a feeding gastrostomy because we are not going to keep him on, IV fluids for quite long. Moving on to the next scenario. Yes, so are you all ready to answer? So here we have Sumit, a 5-year-old male child who presented at around 7 p.m. evening with cough, tachypnea, noisy breathing. And on examination, the child has tachycardia, tachypnea, saturation of 92%, retractions are there. Or if you auscultate the chest, you found that there are bilateral V's and crepitations. Now on going near the patient, you get some peculiar smell. And on probing, we get a history of intake of some blue colored liquid kept in mineral water bottle at 3 p.m. What do you think is going on? What poisoning is this? Yes? Who is going to answer? So Pragya says kerosene. Yes. So remember, I don't know whether you've seen or not, kerosene used to come as a blue colored liquid. So when we were small, I remember that, some blue colored liquid. So they usually used to add some blue color to the kerosene. Yes. So it is a case of kerosene toxicity indeed. Copper sulfate, yes, it is possible, but it is not so readily available in the household unless it's a person who is working in a laboratory with copper sulfate. So kerosene, yes. So it appears to be a case of kerosene poisoning. Okay. And plus you're getting these features of aspiration pneumonitis as well, the peculiar smell, the blue colored liquid kept in the household. So this appears to be a case of kerosene poisoning. And this was the chest X-ray of the child. You can see the bilateral infiltrates that are there, possibly due to the chemical pneumonitis. Okay. Now, clinical features of kerosene poisoning are going to appear within an hour of ingestion. You can get choking, coughing, tachypnea can be there. And within 8 hours, the inflammation is also going to set in and you can get fever, cough. You can get respiratory manifestations like tachypnea, wheezing, grunting, retractions, and crepitations. Now, some of the patients can progress to ARDS by 48 hours and they will have hypoxemia and cyanosis, while most of the cases are going to recover by around 7 to 10 days. Okay. The treatment is primarily supportive. We do not have any specific antidote against it. The main objective is to prevent aspirations. So you do not do a gastric lavage or anything, okay? So lavage or induced vomiting is contraindicated because they will increase the risk of aspiration. Again, steroids and prophylactic antibiotics are not recommended. If you suspect that there's a superadded bacterial infection, then you might use antibiotics. Respiratory support is important. You have to give oxygen, and if required, CPAP and ventilatory support. Okay. Now moving on to the next case scenario. So here you have a 6-year-old male who presented to pediatric emergency with accidental ingestion of half a bottle of a syrup which was prescribed for fever 8 hours back. So he has ingested half of this bottle. And now the child has nausea, vomiting. You did the LFTs, you find the SGOT, SGPT is elevated, and you also have a serum acetaminophen level, which is 16 mics per ml. So what's going on? Yes. So this is a clear-cut case of paracetamol poisoning. Very good, Swati, Shubham, Nikita, and so Pradyuman, you are answering N-acetylcysteine. Yes, so that is the antidote for paracetamol poisoning. Very good. So we know the specific antidote of paracetamol is N-acetylcysteine. But first we need to know how much is the toxic dose of paracetamol, when we should be worried, and what is the indication. If a very small dose has been taken, then we need not give N-acetylcysteine because N-acetylcysteine itself can be toxic. Okay. So, but yes, that is the antidote. Very good. So I'm really impressed by the answers all of you are giving. So how does this paracetamol toxicity happen? So this paracetamol toxicity results from the formation of an intermediate metabolite called N-acetyl P-benzophenonimine. Okay. And what happens is in the overdose of paracetamol, the glutathione stores are depleted and free toxic metabolites cause hepatocellular necrosis. So the glutathione store is depleted and there is hepatic necrosis. So mainly it is the hepatic toxicity that takes place in paracetamol poisoning. The single acute toxic dose of paracetamol is 200 mg per kg. So that means 20 times the usual dose. Okay, 15 to 20 times the usual dose. What is the dose of paracetamol in children? Yes. So if one dose that you have to remember from pediatrics, you must remember the dose of paracetamol. Who can tell me what is the normally the dose of paracetamol that we prescribe in children? Very good, Pariniti. So Pariniti says 15 mg per kg. So 10 to 15 mg per kg per dose is the usual dose of paracetamol that we give, and you can give it 6 hourly. Okay, you can give it up to 6 hourly or as and when required. So the usual dose we said is 10 to 15 mg per kg per dose. So if by mistake someone takes almost 15 times that dose, then you can get toxicity. So single acute toxic dose is more than 200 mg per kg in children and more than 7.5 to 10 grams in adolescents and adults. While chronic administration of more than 90 mg per kg per day for more than 3 consecutive days can also lead to hepatic injury in children. So in the West, where other over-the-counter drugs are not so readily available, paracetamol toxicity is much more commoner than in the Indian scenario. Okay. So now there are some clinical stages. Within 24 hours, if there is paracetamol toxicity, there can be anorexia, vomiting, malaise. The lab reports are going to be normal except the paracetamol level. Okay. And remember, in the initial 3-4 hours, even the paracetamol levels can come normal because it takes some time for the paracetamol to get absorbed and go into the bloodstream. Okay. So immediately within 1 to 2 hours, there is no use of doing paracetamol level. Now, in the next 24 to 48 hours, there can be right upper abdominal pain, tenderness, transaminitis can be there, and INR can be deranged. Okay. By 3 to 5 days, there can be peak elevation of transaminitis, and the patient can either go into liver failure, MODS, and even death can occur, or recovery can begin. So paracetamol toxicity can even be fatal. Okay. And by 4 days to 2 weeks, there is a gradual resolution of liver function abnormalities. Okay. There is a nomogram, which is called the Drumac-Matthew nomogram, that is used to assess the risk of hepatotoxicity. So if you have paracetamol level available, okay, and you know the hours of ingestion, then you can decide whether this child will have hepatotoxicity or not. So say if the child comes to you 24 hours after ingesting paracetamol, and the blood level of paracetamol is 100 microgram per ml. So can you see this 100 microgram per ml at 24 hours? So 24 hours is here. So this child is probably going to have hepatic toxicity. So we need to give N-acetylcysteine to this child. So using this Ramak-Mathew nomogram, we can assess the risk of hepatotoxicity. And if there is probable hepatotoxicity, we should treat them with N-acetylcysteine. But say at 12 hours, if the paracetamol level is only 40, okay, so it will come somewhere here. At 12 hours, paracetamol level somewhere around 40. So in those cases, no need to give N-acetylcysteine. So who can tell me why are we measuring serum paracetamol level at least 4 hours after ingestion? Yes. So why not measure the paracetamol level immediately? So why are we measuring the paracetamol level at least 4 hours after ingestion? Yes, very good, Swati. So we are giving some time for it to get absorbed. Yes, Pariniti, Riya, right? So Shivya, Pragya, okay. So basically we are giving some time for it to get absorbed so that it is reflected in the blood level. Okay, no point doing the paracetamol level immediately after injection. Okay. And so based on this Ramak-Mathew nomogram, you decide whether or not to give N-acetylcysteine, okay, as management. Now, a little bit about organophosphate poisoning, which, as we mentioned, is more important in the rural scenario, but sometimes you do get cases, and it is a very favorite of the exam, whoever takes the exam also. So organophosphates, these are some of the examples: T, PP, parathion, chlorpyrifos, malathion. So these are basically insecticides, okay, which are used, dichlorvos, okay. Now, organophosphates, what will they do? We have already discussed. They are acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Okay, so they have cholinergic action. So organophosphates bind to and inhibit the acetylcholinesterase enzyme. So the degradation of acetylcholine will be prevented, and acetylcholine is going to accumulate at the nerve synapse. If left untreated, organophosphates can even form an irreversible bond with acetylcholinesterase, permanently inactivating the enzyme. But carbamates form temporary bond to the enzyme. So it can have spontaneous resolution and less severe symptoms. Okay. Now what happens in organophosphate poisoning? So acute features, we already mentioned nicotinic action. There can be muscle fasciculations, weakness, cramps, tremors, etc. Due to the muscarinic action, there can be excess salivation, lacrimation, emesis, excessive urination, and so on. I am sure you remember the dumbbells mnemonic. Okay. And because of the central action, there can be anxiety, restlessness, etc. And there can be some delayed action also, okay, and neurological features can be seen. Now, how do you manage a case of organophosphate toxicity? Again, like any emergency, stabilize the airway, breathing, and circulation. Do the decontamination, remove all the exposed clothes, and wash and flush the skin. The specific antidote we mentioned is atropine. So atropine is going to antagonize the muscarinic and central effects of OP poisoning. Okay, it is helpful for both organophosphate and carbamate poisoning. We know the dose is 0.05 mg per kg IV, and you can repeat the dose every 10 to 15 minutes till atropinization is done. What do you mean by atropinization? Atropinization means the chest has now become clear and there is mydriasis. Okay, till then you can repeat the dose of atropine. Now, pralidoxim is another drug which reactivates acetylcholinesterase and antagonizes the nicotinic effects. Okay, but it is not necessary for carbamates. Why it's not necessary for carbamates? Because the bond which the carbamates make with the acetylcholinesterase enzyme, it degrades spontaneously. So spontaneous improvement will anyways occur, and carbamate poisoning cases are less severe. Apart from that, of course, symptomatic management needs to be done. So benzodiazepines need to be added for if there are seizures or anxiety or agitation. Okay. Now a little bit about lead poisoning, which is important in children. Okay, because it can have a lot of consequences. So these are some common substances which used to have lead till the recent past. The old paints, okay, a lot of colorful toys of children. The cosmetics used to have it. Okay, nowadays they don't have it, but previously these items were thought to be quite rich in lead. So non-nutritive hand-to-mouth activity. So the children, they have a tendency to take everything and put them in their mouth, put it in their mouth. The toys and everything, you would have seen small children taking them in their mouth. So this non-nutritive hand-to-mouth activity of young children is the most important risk factor for lead poisoning in children. So exposure to lead containing paint chips, batteries, okay, cosmetics, toys, and so on, they are the risk factors. What are the clinical features that are possible due to lead poisoning? So GI features like loss of appetite, abdominal pain, vomiting, and constipation is possible. In the CNS finding, there can be headache, altered sensorium, okay? There can even be seizures and coma. And at high levels, you can get even renal tubular dysfunction and Fanconi syndrome-like picture. So amino aciduria and so on, proximal RTA-like features. RBC survival is also shortened, so you can get a hemolytic anemia and a lot of findings on the peripheral smear in lead poisoning. I'm sure you would have discussed in pathology, okay? And older patients can even have peripheral neuropathy leading to wrist drop and foot drop. So many consequences are possible in children due to lead poisoning. How do you diagnose it? One is the history of pica and a history of, ingestion of such substances would be there. If you do a blood lead level, if it is more than or greater than equal to 45 mics per dl, it indicates severe poisoning. And encephalopathy is seen in those who have a level more than 100 mics per dl. Now, what is very, very important is because these cognitive and behavioral effects that lead is causing may be irreversible. So it is very, very important to prevent lead poisoning rather than treat it. Okay. So prevent it from occurring and prevent further ingestion, right? So to manage, you have to identify and eliminate the environmental source of lead. You have to try to modify the behavior of these children. Okay, behavioral modification to reduce the non-nutritive hand-to-mouth activity. Dietary counseling has to be done. Okay. And for children with more severe lead poisoning, you have to use drugs like chelating agents like oral DMSA, dimercaprosuccinic acid, or penicillamine, okay? And parenterally EDTA or dimercaprol can be used. Now, what is very, very important, as you can see, poisoning has so many consequences in children or in anyone for that matter. And in children, we already mentioned as the most common cause of poisoning is, what is the most common cause of poisoning in children? Yes. What is the most common cause of poisoning in children? Accidental. Very good. So Nilayan, Shivaya, Swati, very good. Pushkal, Shubham. So accidental ingestion is most common in children. So we can do some things to prevent that. What all can we do? We have to educate the parents and caregivers about it. All drugs and toxic substances should be kept in locked cabinet. Okay. All household poisons must be kept separate from food. Okay, like cockroach killer, rat killer, and all those. So you do not keep them in the same place where you keep the food items. All pesticides and medicines should be kept preferably in their original containers and properly closed. Okay, and label them always. Do not keep household cleaners like Harpic and all. A lot of people, what they do is they have these cupboards below their wash basins and they keep the Harpic and liquid detergent and things like that, phenyl and everything in that cupboard. That is very, very dangerous for small children. Don't store these things in these cupboards which are readily accessible by the toddlers. Okay. And if you're storing here, lock it. Okay. So very important to prevent. And the label of, so if you're giving any medicine to the child or to anyone, do not give the medicine in the dark, and the label should be read well before using the drug. Okay. So these are certain small steps by which we can prevent poisoning in children and its consequences. Okay. So what I want you to remember is the most common age group of children involved in poisoning is 1 to 5 year age group. It is more common in males and in whom there's a previous history of ingestion, especially in low and middle income countries like India. The most common route is ingestion. Most common poisoning that we see in our scenario is kerosene poisoning and corrosive poisoning. Whenever a child with suspected poisoning comes to you, look actively for toxidromes. Remember, treat the patient, not the poison. And most useful decontamination method to treat the poisoning is activated charcoal. Okay. So remember, safety doesn't happen by accident. You have to take steps to ensure safety, right? So that is all from my side. If you have any queries, you can ask me now or you can email it to me. Okay, I'll be happy to answer. So that is a brief overview of the important poisons and the things that we need to remember about it. Hope you have benefited from this class. Okay, and just try to, whenever you're trying to read things, just try to recollect and integrate what all you have read in. So poisoning, as you could see this, you would have read in your forensic classes also, a little bit in your pharmacology classes also. And you know the basics like the action of sympathetic, parasympathetic, and so on, you would have learned in your physiology also. Okay. So you have to try to integrate things together and you have to try to, understand wherever possible the clinical features that is happening and what could be the antidote. Okay. And so on. All right. So that is all from my side. Thank you so much for listening and study hard. All the very best. Okay. So I'm logging off. If you have any queries, you can email it to me. Thank you.